The camera moves through darkness. Water, the sound of oars cutting through still harbor. Boston, December 16th, 1773, nearly midnight. Torchlight flickers on the faces of men dressed as Mohawk Indians. War paint streaks their cheeks. Their disguises are crude, obvious, unconvincing. They are not trying to fool anyone. They are making a statement. The camera follows them up the sides of 3 merchant ships anchored in Griffin's Wharf: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver. In their holds, 342 chests of East India Company tea, 92,000 pounds of dried leaves, worth approximately 10,000 pounds sterling. For 3 hours, these men work in near silence. Hatchets split open wooden chests. Tea cascades into the black water of Boston Harbor. The tide carries it away. By morning, the harbor will smell of bergamot and broken empire. Revolutions are not fought over freedom. They are fought over who collects the taxes. We are taught a story about the American Revolution. It is a story of liberty and tyranny, of noble colonists throwing off the yoke of an oppressive king, of patriots who believed all men were created equal, who pledged their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor to the cause of freedom. This story is true, but it is incomplete. Beneath the rhetoric of rights and representation, another struggle was taking place, a struggle over money, over debt, over who would control the economic destiny of a continent. The American Revolution was not simply a war for independence. It was a hostile takeover, a leveraged buyout of British North America, financed by Britain's enemies, executed by men who understood that empires are not defeated on battlefields alone. They are defeated in counting houses, in currency markets, in the slow, quiet accumulation of unpayable debt. This is the story of how America bankrupted Britain out of its own colonies, not through superior virtue, through superior leverage. To understand what happened, we must understand what the British Empire actually was in 1763. Britain had just won the 7 Years' War. Known in America as the French and Indian War, it had been the first true world war, fought across 5 continents, from the forests of Pennsylvania to the plains of India. Britain had emerged victorious. France had been expelled from North America. Spain had been humbled. The British flag flew over territory stretching from Hudson Bay to the Caribbean, from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. But victory had come at a price. The war had cost Britain approximately £137 million, a sum so vast it nearly doubled the national debt. Interest payments alone now consumed over half of government revenue. The Treasury was hemorrhaging money, and the fighting was not entirely over. The newly conquered territories required administration. They required defense. Pontiac's Rebellion, an uprising of Native American nations, erupted in 1763 and demonstrated that holding territory was as expensive as taking it. British regulars would need to remain in North America permanently. Someone would have to pay for them. The British government looked at its ledgers, it looked at its colonies, and it made a decision that seemed logical at the time. The colonists would pay. This was the logic of empire. Colonies exist to enrich the mother country. The American colonies had been founded to produce raw materials, to consume British manufactures, to generate trade that would flow through British ports and fill British coffers. For a century and a half, this arrangement had functioned, imperfectly, with smuggling and evasion, but functioned nonetheless. The Navigation Acts required colonial goods to pass through British ports. The Molasses Act taxed foreign sugar. The Wool Act prohibited colonial textile exports. These laws created a closed economic system, a captive market that existed to serve British interests. But the colonists had grown used to a certain degree of autonomy. The Atlantic Ocean was wide. British officials were few. Laws were loosely enforced. The colonists had developed their own trade networks, their own manufacturing, their own sense of economic independence. Now Britain intended to tighten its grip, and the colonists would learn what it truly meant to be subjects of an empire. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767. Each new law was an attempt to extract revenue from the colonies. Each new law met resistance. The conventional narrative focuses on the slogan, "No taxation without representation." And this was indeed a powerful grievance, but the reality was more complex. The colonists were not opposed to taxation in principle. They paid local taxes willingly enough. What they opposed was the specific nature of British taxation and the economic control it represented. The Stamp Act required that virtually all paper documents be printed on specially stamped paper purchased from British authorities. Legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, dice. This was not merely a tax, it was a surveillance mechanism. Every transaction would be visible to the Crown. Every contract would require official approval. The informal economy that had allowed colonial prosperity would be brought under imperial control. The Townshend Acts were worse. They taxed imports, glass, lead, paint, paper, tea, and used the revenue to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. This was the crucial detail. Previously, colonial assemblies had controlled official salaries. This gave them leverage. A governor who displeased the assembly might find his pay delayed. A judge who ruled against colonial interests might discover his income dependent on colonial goodwill. The Townshend Acts broke this lever. Royal officials would be paid directly by the crown, from taxes collected in the colonies. They would owe nothing to local assemblies. They would be instruments of London, answerable only to London. This was not taxation. It was economic colonization. The colonial response was sophisticated, and it was financial. Boycotts were organized throughout the colonies. Merchants agreed not to import British goods. Women formed spinning societies, producing homespun cloth to replace British textiles. The phrase "Buy American" did not yet exist, but the concept was born in these years. The economic impact was significant. British exports to the colonies dropped by nearly 40% between 1768 and 1769. British merchants, watching their profits evaporate, pressured Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. Most of the duties were withdrawn, but one remained: the tax on tea. This was deliberate. Lord North, the Prime Minister, insisted that one tax be retained as a symbol. Britain would demonstrate that it possessed the right to tax the colonies, even if it chose not to exercise that right fully. The principle mattered more than the revenue. The colonists understood this perfectly, and they responded by attacking the principle directly. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot. It was a carefully planned act of economic sabotage. The men who boarded those ships were not a mob. They were organized by Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, a network of merchants, artisans, and professionals who understood that empires are held together by commerce. Disrupt the commerce, and you threaten the empire. The tea they destroyed belonged to the East India Company, not merely a trading firm, but an arm of the British state itself. The company held a monopoly on British tea trade. It collected taxes in India. It maintained private armies. It was the mechanism through which Britain extracted wealth from Asia. By destroying East India Company property, the colonists were attacking the financial infrastructure of empire. They were sending a message that could be read in London as counting houses as clearly as in Parliament. British commercial interests were not safe in America. The response was swift and punitive. The coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for. Massachusetts was placed under military governance. British officials accused of crimes would be tried in Britain, beyond colonial jurisdiction. These measures were intended to isolate Massachusetts, to make an example of Boston, to frighten other colonies into submission. They had the opposite effect. The other colonies recognized what Britain was demonstrating, that colonial rights existed only at the pleasure of Parliament, that trade could be closed by decree, that local governance could be suspended on command, that property could be seized, economies strangled, populations punished collectively for the actions of individuals. If this could happen to Massachusetts, it could happen anywhere. The economic freedom of every colony was suddenly contingent, provisional, revocable. Committees of correspondence, networks that had formed to coordinate boycotts, became nodes of organized resistance. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in September 1774. Delegates from 12 colonies agreed to a Continental Association, a comprehensive boycott of British goods enforced by local committees with the power to punish violators. This was not a petition. It was economic warfare. American merchants were being organized into an alternative system, one that no longer depended on British trade, British credit, British approval. The infrastructure of independence was being built before the first shot was fired. The war began in April 1775. Lexington, conquered. The shot heard round the world. But the real battle was already being waged in ledgers and account books, and Britain was losing. The British strategy depended on a simple calculation. The colonies could not survive economically without access to British markets and British credit. Rebellion would lead to economic collapse. Economic collapse would break colonial resistance. The war would be won without significant fighting. This calculation was wrong. The colonies had been preparing for economic independence for a decade. They had built domestic manufacturing capacity. They had developed alternative trade networks with France, with Spain, with the Dutch, with anyone willing to defy British commercial restrictions. And they had something Britain had not anticipated: foreign financial backing. France saw the American rebellion as an opportunity, not an opportunity to spread liberty. The French monarchy had no interest in popular sovereignty, but an opportunity to weaken Britain. The 7 Years' War had been catastrophic for France. It had lost Canada. It had lost India. It had lost prestige. The French treasury was desperate to restore French power, and American independence offered the cheapest possible path. Beginning in 1776, France began secretly supplying the American rebels. Money flowed through dummy corporations, most notably Rodrigue Hortalez et Compagnie, a front organization created by the playwright Beaumarchais with French government backing. Weapons, ammunition, uniforms, gunpowder, the material requirements of an army, crossed the Atlantic in ships flying neutral flags. By some estimates, 90% of the gunpowder used by American forces in the first years of the war came from French sources. The Continental Army was clothed in French uniforms, armed with French muskets, supplied by French loans. This was not charity, it was investment. France was financing a proxy war against its primary rival, and the return on investment would be British humiliation. Spain joined later, motivated by similar calculations. The Dutch provided loans through banking houses in Amsterdam. The American Revolution was being funded by an international consortium united by a single purpose: the destruction of British commercial supremacy. The Continental Congress understood that it was fighting a financial war as much as a military one, and it used every tool available. The printing press was the most important weapon in the early years. Congress authorized the issuance of continental currency, paper money backed by nothing but the promise of future redemption. Between 1775 and 1779, approximately $240 million in continental notes were printed. This was inflationary finance. The money supply expanded far faster than the economy could absorb. Prices rose. The value of continental currency fell. By 1780, the phrase "not worth a continental" had entered the language. But inflation, in this context, was a feature rather than a bug. It transferred wealth from creditors to debtors. It allowed the government to pay soldiers and suppliers with paper that cost almost nothing to produce. It was a hidden tax on anyone holding currency, which meant primarily the wealthy. The wealthy complained, but the war continued. Robert Morris understood money as a weapon. As superintendent of finance from 1781 to 1784, he built the financial infrastructure that sustained the war in its final years. Morris was a merchant, one of the richest men in America. He had made his fortune in trade, in privateering, in the opportunities that war creates for those who know how to exploit them. He was not an idealist. He was a pragmatist who understood that armies march on gold as much as courage. He established the Bank of North America, the first chartered bank in the United States. He negotiated loans from France and the Netherlands. He pledged his personal credit when government credit was exhausted. He created a system where private wealth and public purpose were intertwined, where the revolution's success would mean the success of its financiers. This was the bargain that built America. Wealthy men would fund the war, and in return, the new nation would protect their wealth. Property rights would be sacred. Debts would be honored. The financial class would have a permanent stake in the republic's survival. It was not equality. It was not democracy as we imagine it. It was leverage, deployed for independence. Meanwhile, Britain was bleeding. The war that was supposed to be quick and inexpensive became an endless drain. British forces won battles but could not hold territory. The colonial population was too dispersed, the geography too vast, the resistance too persistent, and the costs mounted. By 1780, Britain was spending approximately £20 million annually on the American war, more than its entire peacetime budget. The national debt, already swollen from the 7 Years' War, climbed toward £250 million. Worse, the war was disrupting the trade that had made such borrowing possible. American markets were closed. Caribbean commerce was threatened by American privateers. French and Spanish fleets challenged British naval supremacy. The commercial system that underwrote British credit was cracking. British government bonds, consols, began to fall in value. Interest rates rose. The Treasury found it increasingly difficult to borrow at acceptable terms. The war was becoming financially unsustainable. The turning point came not at Yorktown, but in the bond markets of London. By 1781, British public opinion had shifted. The war was unpopular, not because of sympathy for American liberty, but because of its cost. Merchants saw their profits declining. Taxpayers saw their burdens increasing. Members of Parliament faced constituents who wanted the hemorrhage stopped. Lord North's government fell in March 1782. The new ministry, led by the Marquis of Rockingham, had campaigned on ending the war. Peace negotiations began almost immediately. At the bargaining table, the Americans held stronger cards than their military position alone would suggest. They had demonstrated that holding the colonies would require permanent war. They had shown that Britain's rivals would fund that war indefinitely. They had proven that the cost of empire could exceed the benefits of empire. The Peace of Paris, signed in September 1783, recognized American independence. Britain withdrew its forces. The 13 colonies became a sovereign nation. But the financial consequences rippled for decades. Britain did not collapse. It adapted. The loss of America forced a reorientation of British commerce toward India, toward Asia, toward the markets that would define the 19th century empire. In some ways, losing America liberated British capital for more profitable ventures. But the wound was real. Britain had been humiliated by its own colonists with the assistance of its oldest enemies. The myth of imperial invincibility was broken. The precedent of successful colonial rebellion was established, and the debt remained. The American War added approximately £100 million to Britain's obligations. Combined with previous wars, the total national debt reached £250 million by 1783, a figure that would take generations to reduce. Interest payments consume resources that might otherwise have built schools, roads, navies. The cost of losing America was paid by British taxpayers for the next century. The new American nation faced its own financial reckoning. The continental currency was worthless. The state governments were deeply in debt. The Continental Congress owed money to France, to the Netherlands, to domestic creditors who had accepted promissory notes in lieu of payment. The revolution had been won on credit, and now the bill was due. Alexander Hamilton understood this moment better than anyone. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, he proposed a comprehensive financial settlement. The federal government would assume all state debts, consolidate them into a single national obligation, and service them faithfully. This was controversial. States that had paid their debts felt cheated. States that had borrowed heavily felt relieved. Speculators who had purchased depreciated notes at pennies on the dollar would receive full value. But Hamilton saw beyond the immediate injustice. He understood that credit was the foundation of national power. A nation that honored its debts could borrow cheaply. A nation that defaulted would be shut out of international capital markets, dependent on the goodwill of foreign powers. The United States would be different. It would be a nation built on creditworthiness. Its word would be its bond. The financial revolution Hamilton engineered created the infrastructure of American power. A national bank, a stable currency, a debt market that attracted foreign investment. These were the foundations upon which westward expansion would be built, upon which the industrial economy would rise. The men who had financed the revolution, Morris, Hamilton, the merchant class of the seaboard cities, became the aristocracy of the new republic. Not aristocracy of blood, but of capital. Their interests would be protected. Their debts would be honored. Their vision of a commercial nation would triumph over the agrarian republicanism of Jefferson and his allies. This was the bargain that made independence possible. The price of liberty was the creation of a financial elite whose interests would shape American policy for generations. And what of Britain's remaining presence in North America? It did not vanish overnight. British forces remained in frontier posts for years after the treaty. British merchants continued to dominate American trade. British creditors held American debts. The economic ties of empire proved harder to sever than the political ones. The War of 1812 was, in many ways, the continuation of the Revolution, another attempt to force Britain to acknowledge American sovereignty fully. It ended in stalemate, but it established that the United States could survive a second war with Britain. Investment in America became safer. Capital began to flow. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 declared the entire Western Hemisphere closed to European colonization. Britain, recognizing the limits of its power, acquiesced. The Royal Navy, ironically, became the enforcer of American hegemony. British interests in Latin American trade were better served by independent republics than by Spanish colonies. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain had accepted what the American Revolution had demonstrated, that the cost of holding unwilling territory exceeded the benefits. The economics of empire had changed. The camera pulls back. We are in Boston Harbor again. December 1773, the tea is sinking into dark water. The men who did this understood something that their descendants would forget. They understood that power follows money, that empires are held together by ledgers as much as armies, that the way to defeat a superpower is not to match its strength, but to make its strength too expensive to use. The American Revolution was not won at Valley Forge or Yorktown. It was won in the counting houses of Paris and Amsterdam, where French and Dutch bankers calculated that British decline was worth financing. It was won in the halls of Parliament, where members faced constituents who demanded an end to the bleeding. It was won in the slow accumulation of debt that made victory more expensive than defeat. Britain did not lose America because it was tyrannical. It lost America because it was broke, because it had borrowed too much, spent too much, demanded too much from colonies that had learned to survive without it. The Revolution was not a rejection of empire. It was a foreclosure. The American Revolutionary War added £100 million to British national debt. Britain was still servicing this debt when World War I began, 131 years later. America did not win its freedom through self-evident truths alone. It won by proving that the cost of an empire can exceed the value of its colonies.